You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Kenyan elections. There were fears of a repeat of events in 2007, when disputed results led to violence that saw more than 1,000 deaths, widespread sexual violence against women, and about 600,000 people displaced. But although there were deadly attacks attributed to separatists in coastal areas, election day passed off relatively peacefully amid a high voter turnout. Kenya also has a new Western-style liberal constitution and a new devolved government structure designed to ensure more accountability. But complications remain. Uhuru Kenyatta, the country's richest man and the son of its first president, is the leading candidate for the presidency, but he is also wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges related to the violence in 2007. If Kenyatta wins and refuses to appear before the court, how would the international community react? With me in the studio to discuss all this are Gemma Jones, an anthropologist from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine who is blogging the elections for the LSE, and Matthew Searle, a Kenya analyst at Business Monitor International. And over the phone from the Kenyan capital Nairobi, we have Anne O'Mahony, who is Kenya Country Director for Concern Worldwide, and James Reinl, who is a freelance foreign correspondent based in Kenya. Matthew Searle, were all our fears of violence misplaced, or is there still a risk that things could go out of control in Kenya?
I would say at this stage it's probably too early to tell whether sort of any perceived risks of violence were misplaced or not. I don't think there was ever any question that the voting process itself would be too much marred by violence. But much like in 2007, the concerns are about when the results are announced and whether those results are accepted by both the politicians involved and by their supporters on the streets. So I think it's probably too early to tell in that regard.
James Reinl, you're in Nairobi and you are in fact a foreign correspondent. Have you been talking up the fears of violence, and in general, what was the atmosphere like on polling day and how is it now?
Well, I went down to a few polling stations, some in Kibera, which is one of the biggest slums in Nairobi yesterday, and it was very orderly, it was very peaceful, everyone was, lining up peacefully, often waiting outside polling stations for 6, 7, 8 hours, even longer perhaps, so they could cast their vote. There was a really high voter turnout, something like 70 to 80% of the 14.3 million Kenyans who were registered to vote. And there was seemingly like a very strong mantra, which has been echoed by a lot of the NGOs and government officials in the run-up to this election, that there must be peace. This is an opportunity for Kenyans to demonstrate that they can act peacefully. And, that has, carried off until now. And I guess, really, you just don't know what's going to happen until a winner is declared and you see how the other guy responds to that.
Anne O'Mahony, your organisation, Concern Worldwide, was on alert. Are you still, therefore, on alert? Or do you think the wounds of 2007, 2008 have to some extent been healed?
We're very much in a watching stage. We're watching the results coming in, but it is how they're going to be announced and what's going to happen, I think, overnight. If there's going to be a big change in what the numbers are over the next few hours or overnight, then people are going to get suspicious, and we really have to be careful and on the alert. Driving around Nairobi today, it is eerily quiet. There is nobody out. Most businesses are closed and matatus are not operating, so people are not able to get to work. So it's a holiday without the holiday atmosphere. If things go well, it's going to mean a huge thing for Kenya in terms of its leadership in the area, in terms of its economic growth and development. And I think we're all sort of sitting with bated breath, hoping that it will go well, that it will go peacefully, and that if there are any disputes, that they will be resolved through the courts rather than with the machete and the gun. The reform of the judicial process over the last few years, since the last elections, I think could be a huge contributory factor to this. And let's hope that people will behave in that way.
Tom, I think as well, all of this talk about fears of violence, etc., have really sort of taken people's attention away from what really has gone well in this election. I think in the lead-up, Kenya held its first presidential debates where all 8 candidates sort of faced off and answered questions from the media. And those debates were very sort of transparent and elucidating. I mean, the candidates were forced to answer sort of the controversial issues in a way that doesn't happen in many other countries in the world, let alone Africa. There's been extremely high voter turnout, which shows that the Kenyans are keen to participate in the democracy. The polls, as the other speakers have said, have been largely peaceful. This was despite major delays, extreme heat. And I just think if it was the sort of tinderbox that the international media portray it to be, that those conditions probably would have led to an explosion of violence. So I think all this talk about violence has really taken the focus away from a lot of what has gone well with the election as well.
Gemma Jones, I want to bring you in here. The divisions in Kenya, if you like, the portrayal of the country as a tinderbox. The place is often portrayed as sort of riven by tribal rivalries. How accurate is that, or are we seeing, what are the kind of fault lines in the country?
I mean, Kenya is a country made up of lots of different tribes, and tribes are a very important feature of the identity of people as Kenyans. However, tribes themselves can further divide down into clans, into subclans, and ultimately into families. So you have to think a little bit about the way in which people are voting and the way that people feel and being part of a bigger team. Sometimes that team is being part of your tribe. Sometimes it's being part of your tribe that's allied to another tribe. It's quite hard, I think, sometimes for people, especially in the region where I worked, to try and vote according to policies when they have loyalties in relation to tribe. But that doesn't mean that people aren't able to think about policies at the moment.
Okay.
Was your question there looking for a more straightforward explanation of the tribal divide in Kenya and how that's being played out in the current elections?
Yeah, if you have something to offer, James Reinhold, please do say it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a slightly more. I mean, of course, I understand all the nuances that the other guest was talking about, but in a more straightforward fashion, you have two main candidates. One of them is Uhuru Kenyatta, and he represents Kenya's biggest tribe to some extent. He is the Kikuyu. Now, the Kikuyus have sort of dominated Kenyan politics since independence from Britain in 1963. There is another candidate, and he's called Raila Odinga, and he represents the Luo community, which is a big tribe, but not the biggest in Kenya. And in many ways, this election is playing out a long-running saga of tribal and dynastic politics that have existed in Kenya since, like I say, independence from Britain in the 1960s.
Matthew Searle, how high are the stakes for Kenya in terms of getting through this election without descending into anarchy? And how important is it for Africa as a whole, which is, it's something of a sort of investor's darling at the moment. People are talking up its economic prospects, but, chaos in Kenya, would that seem to throw the whole idea of emerging, confident Africa into doubt?
In terms of the economic impact on Kenya itself, I mean, we saw back in 2008, the economy slowed to grow by about 1.8% during that year. And that's compared to sort of a sub-Saharan African average of 5% annual growth. So it was significantly below the average. Obviously, there were other issues at play. There was a global financial crisis sort of unfolding at the time, which was swiftly followed by a regional drought, which has kept growth sort of relatively low. But now sort of the global economy is not in great shape by any means, but it's better than it was in 2008. So if Kenya can come out of this election sort of relatively unscathed, I think the conditions exist for it to sort of return to sort of trend growth of 5 to 6 to 7% over the next 10 years. So I think it's crucial from a perception perspective for foreign investors to become comfortable if Kenya is to get back to these high levels of growth. With regard to the region as a whole, it is important because I think a lot of people who look at Kenya, sort of be it analysts or international media, look at Africa as sort of a homogenous block. And when there's a problem in one country, that's often sort of extrapolated to being problems for lots of other countries. That's, of course, is not the case, but that's simply the way that it is viewed. So I think from a perception perspective, once again, for Africa, Kenya being an economic and political powerhouse, it's extremely important. And finally, just Kenya is obviously part of the East African community, which is sort of a burgeoning economic and political bloc, very important sort of geopolitically and economically on the continent. Kenya is seen as sort of a springboard into that community. So I think for a lot of the neighboring countries, success at these elections will also bode well for the prospects of their economies as well.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Kenyan elections. I'm joined in the studio video by Gemma Jones, an anthropologist from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Matthew Searle, a Kenya analyst at Business Monitor International. And over the phone from the Kenyan capital Nairobi, we have Anna Mahoney, Kenya Country Director for Concern Worldwide, and James Reinl, a freelance foreign correspondent. Gemma Jones, you've worked extensively in rural Kenya. What are the main concerns for voters in the Kenyan countryside?
I mean, I think when we've been interviewing people about what they're looking for, they're talking about things like improved access to water, sanitation, lack of matches, things like opportunities to run small businesses. These are very small concerns, I think, in comparison to some of the things that Matthew's talking about. And I don't necessarily think that some of these people, when they're voting, are thinking that any change in the government is going to actually affect that aspect of their lives. You have to remember that the two presidential contenders at the moment are both sons of prominent African politicians. They were both in the current coalition government, which has just come to an end. So whether one of them wins or not, in terms of these issues on the ground, in terms of whether that will increase your access to education or matches or HIV drugs, I don't know if that is going to represent a brand new change for Kenya.
Anna Mahoney, how pressing are some of the humanitarian issues in Kenya, and is there a sense that these, scions of the elite will take them seriously?
I think one of the things about this whole election campaign is that there were not clear manifestos. So it was difficult to make a decision, I think, between candidates based on their election promises or whatever. They were all saying much the same thing. So for people on the ground that wanted to make a decision based on policy rather than ethnicity or whether somebody was before the ICC or not, it was quite difficult. I think there's a huge hope invested in the new structure of government, with the county governance structure coming in as part of this process, and linked into that the devolved budget. And there's a sense that counties on the ground, certainly in the more remote areas that have been marginalised for so long, where we would deal with humanitarian and longer-term development issues, there's a huge amount of hope invested in this, that the devolved government and devolved budget and expenditure will actually have a real impact on people's lives in terms of service delivery. And I think for most people in the rural areas, it is more who is going to be the county governor rather than the president that's going to affect their day-to-day lives. The results of those have not started to come through yet, and some of those certainly were flashpoints around the country in the lead up to the election. But we will have to see what comes out of this and whether, again, the results of these governorship positions will be respected and agreed to.
How have the Kenyan people welcomed this new federated structure of government?
Yes, I think they have. They've been toying around with some sort of a devolved budget over the last number of years through these county development funds and the local development funds. But never to the extent that this devolution is going to happen. Now, there is a 3-year window of rolling it out, so people will have to be a little bit patient, and they won't see the money arriving into their county sort of first thing on next Monday morning. So it's going to take time, and there is going to be a requirement for some patience. But we will have to work through that process with the people that we're working with.
Gemma Jones, you want to come in here?
Yeah, just going back to what Anne said about the position of governor, that's a particularly interesting position because it has opened up a space for lots of people who haven't tried their hand at politics before or don't have this historical relationship with politics to enter into the political arena. And you actually find that quite a lot of the candidates have business experience. They might have been CEOs of companies. This is the first time. And so I think the candidacy, the devolved government and the governorship roles will be quite an interesting place for thinking about change in the future for development in Kenya. You have to remember that the new constitution, which set this government in motion, was only promulgated in 2010. So it's still a learning process in how it's actually going to work. I mean, for example, the county assembly offices haven't been built yet. So I think other African countries will be watching, but also waiting to see how it plays out.
James Reinl in Nairobi, Kenya does have an awful reputation for corruption. Is there any sense that this could be tackled under the new system?
If you look at the presidential debates, I mean, it's quite easy to say, yes, what we need to do is we need to improve Kenya's education system. We need to make jobs. We need to improve infrastructure. I mean, these are all no-brainers. It's a developing country, and it's pretty obvious the kind of things that need to happen. Specifically to answer your question, I must say I think it's a little unlikely that corruption is going to be addressed. It's a big problem here, of course. In the second presidential debate, as Matthew Searle said earlier, it was very interesting to watch the 8 protagonists asking each other very, very tough questions. And some of the questions they were asking of each other was about all these political and economic scandals that have dogged their careers. And it was quite fascinating to watch that among these 8 candidates, it seemed like there was almost none of them that didn't have a bit of mud that could be slung at them. So I think maybe because of this voting along ethnic lines, this lack of a discussion of policy, that when we get a new leader in this country, which will either be Uhuru Kenyatta or Raila Odinga, most likely, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be an end to corruption, or that we're going to necessarily enter a new period of great political leadership here.
Matthew Searle, is it just simply taking time for a sort of policy-based approach to politics to emerge?
That's a good question, Tom, and I don't know if I'm in a position to answer it, to be honest. I agree with all the other guests that the election has been about sort of co-opting support from different communities, and we've seen that with the example of Musalia Mudavadi, who was initially a member of ODM, Raila Odinga's party. When he was unable to sort of get the presidential ticket for that, he left the party and said that he was going to run independently. Subsequent to that, he agreed in an alliance with Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. When it became clear he wouldn't get the presidential ticket there, he once again went on his own. So you can see that the sort of the creation and the breaking of those alliances were all about the co-option of support from different communities, and was definitely not a marriage of sort of different political players with similar ideologies or policies. So I think as it stands, the signs of progress are minimal. Having said that, I mean, the fact that these politicians are sort of willing to work across different communities and sort of join up, even though it's for political expediency. If we want to be optimistic, perhaps that's providing an example to the communities they represent that, look, we can work with each other to sort of create a better Kenya. But I think it's going to take a lot of time before that is the case.
On the other hand, it's a new electorate, isn't it? They're all quite young. I think a large proportion of the population are under 30. They're increasingly tech savvy, web connected. They know what's going on. They can also see what's going on elsewhere in the world. How does that change the equation, do you think, Matthew Searle?
I think that changes it markedly. I mean, Kenya is one of the most active Twitter nations, certainly in Africa, if not sort of the developing world, if not the world altogether. So I think, the proliferation of this technology, social media, mobile banking, which is sort of allowing sort of funds to be transferred around the economy, is sort of democratizing the political and economic space to a large extent. So I think it is playing a very big part.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Kenyan elections. James Reinl in Nairobi, the International Criminal Court, how delicate a situation could it be if Kenyatta wins?
I mean, it couldn't be more delicate. I mean, I think the first question that is raised by that is, what does that mean? 3 people have gone to the polls and they've democratically chosen a man who is accused by the ICC of crimes against humanity the last time this country went to the polls. I mean, that is an enormous snub to the ICC, and I think that if that does happen, as is starting to look quite likely, that will be a big problem for the ICC and test its credibility, because, of course, the institution, the court, has often been criticised for unfairly targeting African leaders, and the ICC prosecution may indeed have played a role in boosting Kenyatta's success because it energizes his base. He has been able to go to the people, to go to the electorate, and say, now this foreign court is a pawn of the West. It's a pawn of the European powers, and this is a post-colonial form of neo-imperialism, and they are trying to influence the outcome of the election. And this plays well with Kenyan voters, and maybe this is one of the things that has pushed Kenyatta to be having the success that he is having. And, of course, that's just like one of the first questions that it raises, but it raises many, many more questions down the road. For example, what happens if Kenyatta decides that he doesn't, as a president, an elected president, if he decides that he doesn't want to attend trial in The Hague, which is what many people believe he will do, that will mean that you've got a democratically elected president who is defying the International Criminal Court and therefore must be placed under some kind of censure and pressure from the West. And that's going to put Western nations into a very, very difficult position because, I mean, they've got a hard and fast rule, which is they only have necessary contact, I believe is the phrase, necessary contact with an ICC indictee. What that necessary contact is different things to different people. I'll give you an explanation that was given to me from two different European diplomats. One of them said that under those circumstances of a President Kenyatta who is defying the International Criminal Court is that Kenya becomes Sudan and that Kenyatta becomes Bashir. Bashir, of course, being al-Bashir of Sudan, who's under indictment of the ICC. And that means that Western powers start playing a sort of political game, possibly threatening sanctions or reducing trade or limiting the amount of aid that goes through the government and, making political statements and, preventing Bashir or possibly Kenyatta from travel to the West. Of course, that's a problematic decision for Western countries because Kenya is an important ally in counterterrorism operations. It plays an important strategic role in Somalia and South Sudan and other countries in the region. It's the biggest economy in the region. And maybe that means that the West will have to temper or reinterpret the way it would respond to an ICC indictee holding the top job in this nation.
Anno Mahoney, what do you make of what James Reinl has said there? Would that actually, is the credibility of the International Criminal Court at stake here, or will Kenya suddenly find itself being treated like Sudan was?
I think it depends on how the ICC is respected by whichever candidate wins the elections. I think if there's efforts to divert the process and if there's efforts not to respect the court or even to move any sort of court proceedings back to Kenya, I think international sanctions will have to be brought to bear. But I think if either candidate or both candidates actually go ahead and follow due process through the ICC with all that entails, then I think the international community will take a different stance. Kenyatta has been indicted, as has William Ruto, and they have actually attended the court, and they are at the moment following due process. And I think as long as that continues, I think it's going to be okay.
Gemma Jones, what are people in Western Kenya saying about the International Criminal Court, if anything?
Well, what's quite interesting about this is that the original trial date for Uhuru and Ruto to appear before the court was actually next week. And that's already been pushed to August, which means that if there is going to be a second round of voting, then Uhuru is in quite a good position to use that to his advantage to say, look, even these court dates are being delayed. So I think actually this is not necessarily an issue with the ICC that is going to be faced over the next few months. I think the issue of when it really becomes the moment that if Uhuru decides not to comply with the court, when that date will be, might be postponed until even the end of the year.
Matthew Serler, a quick word on the ICC.
I think also looking from a domestic perspective, and this came up in the first debate, the first presidential debate, simply the logistics of running the government is going to be very difficult if Kenyatta wins and if he continues to sort of comply with the ICC requirements. He's going to have to be at The Hague. I don't know sort of how much that's going to be the case, but that will preclude him from chairing weekly cabinet meetings. It'll preclude him from signing in legislation that the Parliament has passed. As we've talked about, Kenya's at a very sort of fragile, important point, in sort of economically and politically, with wars in Somalia and sort of the economy ready to take off. So to have the president absent to sort of navigate the political and economic sort of ship through all of this will be very challenging.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. I just want to ask all our guests to kind of offer a sort of level of optimism or pessimism for the next couple of months, very briefly, in Kenya. James Reinl, optimistic?
I don't know if I can sum up what I think in terms of a simple phrase like optimistic or pessimistic. I suppose Kenya is still at the crossroads it's been for the last few weeks, which is that on the one hand, it could go into a contested race where one of the winners wins and the other doesn't like it, and we see violence. Or there is the chance that everything that happens will go through the proper constitutional process of the new constitution, and that when we get to the end of this year, 2013, Kenya will be able to celebrate 50 years of independence from the UK, having carried off a peaceful and important election.
Anne O'Mahony, how are you feeling about the next few days and weeks?
I get up some mornings and I'm very pessimistic, and today I feel quite optimistic. I think if the results are respected, and if there is due process through the judicial system for any disputes, then I think Kenya is plotting a course for the future. And I would agree the 50th celebrations are coming up. I think Kenya also has quite a powerful paper in this Vision 2030. And so it sets the country on a course to meet Vision 2030, which is quite a strong paper. So in brief, I'm optimistic at the moment, on condition that the whole situation doesn't deteriorate into violence. At the moment, I don't think it will.
Gemma Jones, optimistic?
I want to answer that by saying there's a phrase in the law which is used in the village where I've been doing my research, and it's been invented especially for these elections. It's okbichalani, and it literally means that things are never quite what they appear to you at the time that you're looking at them. And I think that's a very good way of summing up this electoral process. At the moment, we just don't know. We might be completely convinced that we're right, that things are going to go in one direction, but a factor in this has been surprise. The difference this time is that the whole world is watching. In 2007 and 2008, the violence was so shocking because it seemed to have come out of nowhere, and then there weren't safeguards in place. This time, there's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more social media, as Matthew said. There's a lot of very important figureheads that have come in to try and find a way through this. And the candidates themselves have said, whether or not they stick to it, that they will try and resolve these things through the court. So I'm divided. Matthew
Searle, are you divided?
I am going to hoist myself onto the fence, I'm afraid, and I'm going to give you a sort of a two-pronged answer. I think in the short term, I have to say I'm probably quite pessimistic. I think there's too much uncertainty with the ICC trials, with the announcement of the results. For Kenya to come out completely unscathed from these issues. So I think in the short term there's lots of uncertainty, and that leaves me a little bit concerned. But over the longer term, as I said sort of earlier on, I think that there are very positive signs that the political space in Kenya is opening up, with the social media, with presidential debates. So I think broadly it's on the correct trajectory in the longer term.
I'd like to thank my guests, Gemma Jones, an anthropologist from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Matthew Searle, a Kenya analyst with Business Monitor International, and on the line from Nairobi, Anne O'Mahony, who is Kenya Country Director for Concern Worldwide, and James Reinl, a freelance foreign correspondent in the country. Thank you all very much. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the Kenyan elections. There were fears of a repeat of events in 2007, when disputed results led to violence that saw more than 1,000 deaths, widespread sexual violence against women, and about 600,000 people displaced. But although there were deadly attacks attributed to separatists in coastal areas, Election Day passed off relatively peacefully amid a high voter turnout. Kenya also has a new Western-style liberal constitution and a new devolved government structure designed to ensure more accountability. But complications remain. Uhuru Kenyatta, the country's richest man and the son of its first president, is the leading candidate for the presidency.
I went down to a few polling stations, some in Kibera, which is one of the biggest slums in Nairobi, yesterday, and it was very orderly. It was very peaceful. Everyone was, lining up peacefully, often waiting outside polling stations for 6, 7, 8 hours, even longer perhaps, so they could cast their vote. There was a really high voter turnout, something like 70 to 80% of the 14.3 million Kenyans who were registered to vote. And there was seemingly like a very strong mantra, which has been echoed by a lot of the NGOs and government officials in the run-up to this election, that there must be peace. This is an opportunity for Kenyans to demonstrate that they can act peacefully. And, that has, carried off until now.
Is there still a risk that things could go out of control in Kenya?
I would say at this stage it's probably too early to tell whether sort of any perceived risks of violence were misplaced or not. I don't think there was ever any question that the voting process itself would be too much marred by violence. But much like in 2007, the concerns are about when the results are announced and whether those results are accepted by both the politicians involved and by their supporters on the streets. So I think it's probably too early to tell in that regard.
James Reinl, you're in Nairobi and you are in fact a foreign correspondent. Have you been talking up the fears of violence, and in general, what was the atmosphere like on polling day and how is it now?
All right. And I guess, really, you just don't know what's going to happen until a winner is declared and you see how the other guy responds to that.
Anne O'Mahony, your organisation, Concern Worldwide, was on alert. Are you still, therefore, on alert? Or do you think the wounds of 2007, 2008 have to some extent been healed?
We're very much in a watching stage. We're watching the results coming in, but it is how they're going to be announced and what's going to happen, I think, overnight. If there's going to be a big change in what the numbers are over the next few hours or overnight, then people are going to get suspicious, and we really have to be careful and on the alert. Driving around Nairobi today.
But he is also wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges related to the violence in 2007. If Kenyatta wins and refuses to appear before the court, how would the international community react? With me in the studio to discuss all this are Gemma Jones, an anthropologist from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who is blogging the elections for the LSE, and Matthew Searle, a Kenya analyst at Business Monitor International. And over the phone from the Kenyan capital Nairobi, we have Anne O'Mahony, who is Kenya Country Director for Concern Worldwide, and James Reinl, who is a freelance foreign correspondent based in Kenya. Matthew Searle, were all our fears of violence misplaced, or is